Hello, everyone. I wanted to come on here and talk about an issue that I feel like needs to be addressed. Um, so, a lot of libertarians say that the economic system that we're currently living under is not capitalism, that it's corporatism or a perversion of capitalism in which you have a merging of state and corporate power, which is true. But real quick, a brief digression on that is that in turn was the definition that Benito Mussolini gave for his system of fascism. So technically, you could say we've been living under a pro-fascist state for a while, and that it's simply that the fascism that we currently living under is progressively and gradually getting more authoritarian and more autocratic. Excuse me, but that is always. I digress on that point. But the reality is that the current system that we are living under is a direct evolutionary progression from the free market laissez-faire capitalism of the 16th and 17th centuries. That capitalism as a system has evolved over the course of time. And what you see is that what began with the European burghers or nobles breaking away from feudalism and creating mercantile capitalism and creating the market forces and everything like that, you saw the rise of capitalist revolutions. For example, the United States, the American Revolution was a capitalist revolution. There have been failed capitalist revolutions. The French Revolution I would consider a failed capitalist revolution. The English Civil War was a failed capitalist revolution in a sense. But the way I look at it is that there is a direct line from the free market laissez-faire capitalism of that time to the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, which was powered by steam and the locomotive, ultimately led to, while it led to increased prosperity, it also led to increased inequality. And back then there was little to no regulations of the economy. And so what you ended up having is lots of a lot of commodities that were not always didn't have good quality. They not all of the commodities that were produced had the same standard of quality. There was a lot of unsafe working conditions. Children were crushed under machines. Children. This was back before anti-child labor laws. You'd have workers working 16 to 21 hours. 16 to 18 hours a day. There was no 8-hour work week. People worked every single day. There was no weekends. And people's pay was even more substandard than it is today. But on a digression note, the wages of today are still unlivable compared to the current standard of living. Again, I digress. But the Industrial Revolution ultimately led to the Gilded Age, which, of course, we have another Gilded Age, as a lot of people and even economists are saying we have another Gilded Age. But the reality is that with all the boom of the economy, it ultimately leads to a bust, because the economic forces are based heavily, especially in the market forces and the stock market and finance capital, are all based upon speculation. And so speculation leads to these bubbles within the market forces, within the economy. And when these bubbles burst, it creates economic recession. And you have, throughout the course of the capitalist economy, throughout the history of capitalism, you have periods of boom and bust. And the Great Depression was an example of market speculation to such an extent that it caused the complete collapse of the economy and created a vast surge of unemployment. And it was in that moment that the state realized that they couldn't depend on the capitalists and the market forces to provide stability. And so there were a lot of calls within the government to regulate the markets in order to stabilize them and prevent them from busting. Because when you have a population of people that are thrust into massive unemployment, they're not going to be happy. And so that's where you see the rise of liberalism, is you see them trying to regulate the economy to try to humanize capitalism in order to allow the capitalist class to maintain power. And that's the only reason why regulation and why liberals advocate for regulation is so that the capitalist state can maintain its power. Because the state has always been a tool of one class to dominate all other classes, ultimately. And you can see this throughout human history, regardless of what kind of socioeconomic conditions existed and the various changes throughout human history. You see this, how the state operates, whether it be monarchy or oligarchy or autocracy. It doesn't matter. It's the state has always been a tool which is used by one class to oppress another, whether that be patrician or plebeian and slave, or lord and vassal. It's always been the same. But I digress. The Industrial Revolution, the rise of regulations like the Food and Drug Administration was created during this time period. The rise of antitrust laws, the rise of labor laws, the rise of minimum wage and limited and labor laws. Just labor laws during this time period were just absolutely like one after another, because the state was trying to provide stability. And so you had with that also the rise of imperialism also within the confines of the Industrial Revolution. So governments from all of these various Western nations would get together and basically invade these third world countries, whether that be Africa or Indonesia or Asia. They invaded these countries and started pillaging, exploiting their population's labor and resources. But I'll get into that in part 2, so hang around for part 2.